The Hebrew Bible, for the past 3,000 years, has actually been teaching that the Israelites, on their emigration out of ancient Egypt, actually crossed the Nile River and then migrated along this same Nile River to penetrate the great desert that this river went through. And if the Hebrews migrated along the Nile River, such a migration could never have led them east of Egypt or to Palestine, but only south, into Africa and into Ethiopia. The biblical exodus out of ancient Egypt represents the most systematically suppressed, most widely mistranslated, and most deliberately misrepresented story in the history of literature. The detailed historical blueprint of an ancient nation's history, tragedy, and later miraculous emigration out of the land of captivity and into the promised land has for centuries been systematically mistranslated for the unsuspecting masses and misrepresented on a historical and global scale. No story for the past 2,000 years has been as popular.
The biblical story of the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt is the story of stories.
As celebrated. And as deliberately misrepresented as the biblical exodus out of ancient Egypt, a very ancient and popular story in the Old Testament that is known throughout the world and is celebrated by followers of the three largest faiths: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And no detail in this ancient story is more popular than the epic crossing of the Red Sea, an iconic moment in the Exodus that is remembered by virtually every person who has heard this story, and which has been recaptured in ceremonies and dramatizations across the world for centuries, but is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Yes, the iconic crossing of the Red Sea, when the waters of the Red Sea open up and swallow up Pharaoh and his army. A detail in the Exodus story that you probably have heard about your entire life and have probably taken for granted to be an integral part of this popular story in the Bible is not mentioned anywhere in the original biblical text. This detail appears only in the translations of the Bible.
And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, but God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea.
It isn't the Red Sea. That's a mistranslation that occurred very, very early on. So it's led to the notion that they were at the Gulf of Aqaba or somewhere near the actual big ocean water.
The Greek translation, which appears in most of our English versions, the Greek translation, known as the Septuagint, renders this as Red Sea. Now, that sounds very similar in English. All you do is pull out an E and you got to go from red to read. It's not that easy in Hebrew.
About 3,000 years ago lived in Egypt a people known as Israel. This was a slave class minority that was oppressed in this ancient country for many years, before its dramatic emigration out of the country. This emigration is known as the Exodus, the exiting of Egypt.
Exodus means the way out, the road out.
And the official version of the Exodus, the version that is pushed by media and academia, and is supported by every translation and cinematic depiction of the biblical story, is that the Israelites, on the exodus out of Egypt, migrated east, crossed the Red Sea, wandered for 40 years in the so-called Sinai desert, before finally conquering and settling in the region known today as Palestine, Israel. This is the official version of the Exodus, a version that is supported neither by the biblical text nor history.
Exodus did not happen in the way that it is described in the text on the background of the 13th century BC.
But is promoted heavily by forces in academia and the media for religious and political reasons.
In the 15th century, before the Common Era, the entire Israelite nation migrated out of slavery in Egypt across the Red Sea, doing its thing, through the desert to enter 40 years later the land of Canaan from the east, the land of Canaan being the modern state of Israel, Palestinian territories.
This official version of the biblical story has in recent times faced harsh criticism from scholars and historians who have pointed to the overwhelming lack of archaeological and historical evidence and to the major historical inconsistencies and holes in the story as proof that this story in the Bible is fabricated. For example, why would the Israelites need to cross any sea to get to the Sinai?
Here we are, the Red Sea. Now all we gotta do is swim across.
When the water barrier separating today Egypt from the so-called Sinai desert was prior to the artificial construction of the Suez Canal in the 19th century, mostly a dry land that could simply be crossed on foot. Which sea were the Hebrews crossing? How could the Hebrews wander for 40 years in the so-called Sinai desert and safely settle in Palestine, Israel, when this entire region in the proposed time of the Exodus was under total Egyptian control and was heavily fortified to protect Egypt against invading Asiatics attacking from the east? How do you escape Pharaoh by settling in one of his colonies in the east?
And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area.
Why didn't the Egyptians attack the Hebrews multiple times during the 40 years of wandering? Since the Sinai was not only under total Egyptian control and considered Egypt minor, but was also located only a few miles from Egypt. Why not just finish the Hebrews off if they are already wandering within Egyptian borders? How did the Sinai even accommodate the millions of people that we're told roamed this area for 40 years? Where are the 11 million gallons of drinking water that we today know would be necessary to sustain on a daily basis the millions of Hebrew migrants? How could this tiny area even cover such a large multitude of people?
And for heaven's sake, did we need archaeological work to confirm that an exodus of 2 million was problematic? It had already been calculated long ago that if they were marching, say, 8 across, then when the first ones got to Sinai, half of the people were still in Egypt. And I think it was Bishop Colenso who calculated around 150 years ago the amount of, let's say delicately, residue that many people would have deposited in the Sinai over a period of 40 years, and he concluded that the Sinai wilderness should be fertile.
These are only a handful of the major historical inconsistencies that have been found in the official version of the biblical Exodus out of ancient Egypt. Some of these holes in the biblical story have forced even scholars from the religious community to abandon the traditional literal reading of the Exodus as a historical account.
The archaeological and extra-biblical textual evidence shows that the larger-than-life stories cannot be read literally as history,
and instead view the narratives in the book of Exodus as moral accounts, teaching ethics and morals, rather than actual history.
These are stories that still resonate with us, stories about liberation from tyranny, about the power of an apparently insignificant people to change the course of history, about a new Israel, a promised land here here and now.
Meanwhile, admitting that the Exodus, if it really happened the way that scholars for the past centuries have claimed that it did, would simply be impossible.
Rabbi Wolpe, what did you say?
I said that the Exodus certainly didn't happen the way the Bible depicted it, assuming that it was a historical event in any description. I think that if you look at it scientifically, it's virtually indefensible to make the Bible's case.
But no scholar, neither from the past nor the present, neither from the religious nor the secular world, neither from the maximalist camp nor the minimalist, has ever dared to question the scholars themselves in their presumptuous reading and interpretation of the biblical text. No biblical historian or researcher has ever dared to suggest that maybe the biblical text isn't really the problem.
Is anything in there historical fact?
Very little, probably.
But that the problem maybe lies in the way that these ancient documents have been interpreted for the past centuries. Maybe the Exodus narratives do in fact contain a lot of verifiable historical truths that can be proven with real, tangible material evidence, but that the text might have been completely misread or misinterpreted, and maybe deliberately. The Hebrews entered Egypt in the time of the biblical patriarch Joseph, who at the time of their immigration to this country occupied the second highest position in Egyptian politics. During his lifetime, they enjoyed a relatively good life in Egypt and benefited greatly from his high status in Egyptian society. They lived peacefully in the country and were settled in a region that is referred to in the Bible as Goshen.
And thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen.
In this region, they lived a comfortable lifestyle for generations and increased greatly in number and influence in Egyptian society.
Joseph weeps, he reveals his identity in a very moving scene, and ultimately the family is relocated to and reunited in Egypt, where they live peacefully and prosperously for some generations.
This comfortable lifestyle continued up until the arrival of the Pharaoh of Exodus 1.
Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph.
This particular Pharaoh began to exploit the Hebrews and put them through hard labor, not only for material gains, but primarily to inhibit their growing population.
And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply.
The Hebrews grew too numerous. They might have risen against us.
But when this strategy did not have the desired effect, and the Hebrews continued to grow in population and manpower, Pharaoh resorted to a much more brutal strategy: infanticide. Every firstborn Hebrew male child must be killed at birth.
And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river.
The infanticide campaign was soon implemented throughout all of Egypt, and every firstborn male child among the Hebrews was killed by being seized at birth and thrown into the river.
So the Pharaoh enlists all of the people to annihilate the Israelites by drowning all newborn males in the Nile River.
In the midst of these events, a special child is born somewhere in the Hebrew neighborhoods. A child whose mother attempts to save his life from certain death by putting him in a basket and throwing the basket into an ambiguous river, referred to in Exodus 2:3 simply as the river, Hebrew Yeor, and meaning specifically river. Not ocean, not sea, but only river. This systematically neglected detail in the Hebrew text will be very important soon. Although no direct archaeological or historical evidence has been found of the Hebrew enslavement in Egypt, or at least as it is described in the Bible.
So far, there is no documented evidence about the Exodus.
There is a complete absence of any external written documents testifying to Israel's presence and subjugation in Egypt, to her migration from the land, or to her conquest of Canaan and her settlement there.
There is some indication in the biblical text that suggests that the author of the book of Exodus was actually describing the era of Pharaoh Seti I and Ramses II.
And if there's any historical basis to the Exodus, then the most plausible time, the most plausible backdrop would be the 13th century BCE.
The idea of a 13th century Exodus is much more popular than a 15th century Exodus.
This is indicated primarily by the building projects that are attributed to Hebrew slave labor in the biblical text. The city of Ramses. Located in modern Qantir in northern Egypt and built on a previous Hyksos capital, this city was built by Pharaoh Ramses II. It is known to have been populated only for 2 centuries, sometimes between the 13th and 11th century BC, and was later abandoned and forgotten, and remained relatively unknown until the modern archaeology era.
This important city, which we know Ramses II built, it's being excavated even as we speak and continues to be studied. This city has a very brief history. By around 1100 BC, the city's gone. It has a very narrow history of no more than 200 years. So the question is, if this building project that the Israelites are involved in is Ramses II's Delta residence, then we have no escape but to say this is an important chronological marker, and that can only be somewhere in the 13th century BC.
It would be very unlikely that the author of the book of Exodus would have known about this city if he did not live during the era that this city was active. That is between the 13th and 11th century BC Egypt. The biblical records tie the construction of the city of Ramses to the reign of the first of the 2 pharaohs that ruled during Moses' lifetime. This narrows the alternative down to Pharaoh Seti I, and it puts the enslavement of the Hebrews at sometimes around 13th and 11th century BC. Pharaoh Seti I would therefore have to be the pharaoh who reigned during the infanticide of the Hebrew children, whose daughter found Moses' basket, who died while Moses was in exile in Midian.
And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died,
and was finally replaced by his son, Ramses II, the pharaoh of the Exodus. This chronology also puts the biblical land of Goshen, as previously suspected by scholars, somewhere in the Delta region, where we find both the city of Ramses and the city of Pithom.
We do know archaeologically that the fortified city of Pi-Ramesses, very much like Pithom Ramses, was rebuilt in the early 13th century on the site of the old Hyksos capital. There was a capital, Avaris. They had moved the capital up to the Delta region. Now in the 13th century, this is being rebuilt, and that's in the area of Goshen.
This also narrows down the river in Exodus 1 and 2, the river that the Hebrew children were drowned in, which Moses' mother placed the baby basket in, and which Pharaoh's daughter picked up the basket from, to the Nile of Egypt, the only river in the region, and the only river in all of Egypt.
So the Pharaoh enlists all of the people to annihilate the Israelites by drowning all newborn males in the Nile River. And this leads then to the account of the birth of Moses and his exposure to the Nile River. He's hidden away for 3 months and set among the bulrushes at the edge of the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter will eventually discover him, adopt him, and name him Moses.
Four distinct terms are used in the Hebrew text to identify the river of Egypt: Mayim, Yeor, Nahar, and Yam. Mayim, As the Hebrew plural for water, this word has no specific meaning and is used generally in the Hebrew Bible to identify any significant body of water. Nahar, another general term. This word is used in the Bible to describe rivers. Yeor, a non-Semitic term of ancient Egyptian origin, most likely deriving from a dialect that was used in the city of Memphis. In every appearance of this term in the ancient Egyptian sources, it is used exclusively to identify the Nile River. Similarly, also in the Pentateuch, the word Yeor is used exclusively to identify the Nile River, and particularly the branches and canals of the Nile. The fourth term is Yam. Although the etymology of this word indicates that it was used to describe a swamp-like river, and not necessarily a sea or an ocean, as it is usually translated.
But the name Yam Suf, Reed Sea, implies a more marsh-like setting rather than the open sea.
This word is used in many parts of the Bible to describe different types of water streams, from the streams of the Nile and the Euphrates to the stream of the brass laver inside Solomon's temple. And from Exodus 10, Yam becomes the prefix in the proper name that is given to the Nile River in the Hebrew Bible. Yam Suf. The word Suf simply means reeds, and is meant to describe the reeds that grew vastly in the Nile Delta in ancient times, and were used for many purposes by the Egyptians, including making papyrus and building boats. The first appearance of this word in the book of Exodus is in Exodus 2:3, in the story of Moses' mother placing Moses' basket among the reeds of the Nile River.
And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink.
The text uses Suf here as a literary tool to describe the physical characteristics of the river that carried Moses' basket to Pharaoh's palace. Located in the time of Pharaoh Seti in the city of Memphis, on the borders of the Nile. And again 2 verses later in Exodus 2:5 to identify the river that Pharaoh's daughter found the basket in.
And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it.
The Nile being the only river in this region, scholars naturally identify the Reed River in Exodus 2:3 and Exodus 2:5 with the Nile of Egypt.
Again, there's no doubt about that because Moses' mother placed his basket amongst the reeds, same word. Not among the reds, the reeds.
And it's not until we reach Exodus 13, verses 17 and 18, that the standards suddenly change. In the same Reed Sea that was explicitly identified with the Nile River in every other previous verse, suddenly changes identity. And the Reed Sea, Yam Suf, from Exodus 13, is always translated as the Red Sea.
And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, but God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea.
Based entirely on an old translation error, when the Hebrew Bible was being translated from Greek to English, and a scribal error translated Reed Sea as the Red Sea. The Reed Sea Yam Suf would later be confused with the sea that the ancient Greek cartographers knew as the Erythraean Sea, the sea between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, the modern-day Red Sea. And in spite of scholarly recognition of this scribal error,
when the Greek translators took the Hebrew, Yam Suf, and translated it into Greek, they translated it as Red Sea instead of Reed Sea. So we've been stuck with a faulty translation for over 2,000 years.
The Red Sea mistranslation of the Hebrew Yam Suf is still very prominent in the modern translations of the Bible and is heavily supported in academia and the media.
There's a sea ahead and an army behind! Ready yourselves!
Where are you from?
West of here.
Where are you going?
East.
Where are you from?
West of here.
The land of Canaan being the modern state of Israel, Palestinian territories.
Where are you going?
East.
The Red Sea mistranslation of the Hebrew Yam Suf is not coincidental, but strategic, and is meant to give readers the impression that the Hebrews, on the exodus out of Egypt, migrated east and crossed the Red Sea somewhere at the Gulf of Aqaba. This would locate by default the area that is known in the Bible as the Holy Land, in which the Hebrews migrated to after leaving Egypt, somewhere in northern Arabia, or perhaps the Mediterranean, where we find today Palestine, Israel.
The land of Canaan being the modern state of Israel, Palestinian territories.
A proper reading and translation of Exodus 13 would lead our search for biblical history away from the Mediterranean and take us instead south of Egypt. It would expose the claimed Middle Eastern origin of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is also the foundation of all of Western civilization and culture. And it would completely undermine the validity of the core historical claims that have been used now for more than half a century to justify the existence of a notorious state in the Mediterranean.
You know why we're called Jews? Because we come from Judea. Jacob and his 12 sons roamed these same hills of Judea and Samaria 4,000 years ago.
The Hebrew Bible, for the past 3,000 years, has actually been teaching that the Israelites, on their immigration out of ancient Egypt, actually crossed the Nile River and then migrated along this same Nile River to penetrate the great desert that this river went through. And if the Hebrews migrated along the Nile River, and months after having already left Egypt, were still positioned in a region where they had access to the Nile River, such a migration could never have led them east of Egypt or to Palestine, but only south, into Africa and into Ethiopia, where we in the coming episodes will find the true biblical Holy Land and real biblical history. This is the hidden biblical exodus from ancient Egypt to the Holy Land of Ethiopia.
And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, Hath the Lord indeed...